The chainsaw's roar echoed through Maplewood Estates as Sarah watched 20 years of her grandmother's carefully cultivated hedge fall in brutal chunks. HOA President Margaret Whitman stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed, that smug smile never leaving her face. But what Margaret didn't know was that Sarah Chen had just inherited more than a house. She'd inherited a secret that would turn this entire neighborhood war upside down. Sometimes the best revenge isn't served cold. Sometimes it's served with a century-old deed and a lawyer who's been waiting 40 years for payback. The morning mist still clung to the perfectly manicured lawns of Maplewood Estates when Sarah Chen stepped onto her front porch, coffee mug in hand, and saw the orange, notice fluttering like a surrender flag on her grandmother's prized hedge. Her stomach dropped as she read the bold lettering. Final violation notice. Immediate compliance required. Nai would roll over in her grave, Sarah muttered, fingering the worn edges of the paper. The hedge, a magnificent wall of English. Boxwood that had taken her grandmother Lily Chen 23 years to cultivate, stood 8 feet tall and stretched the entire length of their corner lot. Every branch had been lovingly shaped, every leaf a testament to the old woman's patience and artistry. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from her neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez. "They're coming at 10 a.m. Margaret's hired Thompson Landscaping. I'm sorry. Honey." 10 a.m. Sarah glanced at her watch. 9:47. The sound of diesel engines rumbled down Maple Street like approaching thunder. Sarah's grip tightened on her mug as 2 trucks rounded the corner, a massive wood chipper followed by Thompson, Landscaping's crew cab, both emblazoned with the company's green logo. Behind them, in her pristine white Lexus, came the woman who had turned Sarah's life into a bureaucratic nightmare, Margaret Whitman, president of the Maplewood Estates Homeowners Association. Margaret stepped out of her car with the precision of a general inspecting troops. Her silver hair was pulled into its signature tight bun, her navy blazer immaculate despite the humid September morning. She carried a leather portfolio that Sarah knew contained every violation notice, every complaint, every petty regulation that had been weaponized against the Chen family over the past 6 months. "Mrs. Chen," Margaret called out, her voice carrying that particular brand of authority that came from years of neighborhood politics. "I trust you received our final notice." Sarah walked down her driveway, bare feet silent on the still cool asphalt. "It's Ms. Chen, and yes, I got your threat. It's not a threat. It's enforcement of our community standards." Margaret's smile was sharp as a blade. "Your hedge violates Section 4.2 of our covenant. No landscaping feature shall exceed 6 feet in height without express written approval from the Architectural Review Board." "My grandmother planted this hedge in 2001. It was grandfathered," was being the operative term, Margaret interrupted. "When property changes hands, all previous exemptions are void. You've had 6 months to bring your property into compliance." The crew chief, a weathered man in his 50s, approached with obvious reluctance. "Ma'am, we're here about the hedge work." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. 6 months ago, she'd inherited this house, her sanctuary during childhood. Summers, her grandmother's pride and joy, the only stable thing left after her divorce and job loss, had stripped away everything else. The hedge wasn't just landscaping. It was her grandmother's legacy, her privacy screen, her symbol of the life Nai had built after immigrating from Taiwan with nothing but determination and hope. "There has to be another way," Sarah said, hating how desperate she sounded. "I can trim it down gradually, shape it." The time for negotiation has passed. Margaret opened her portfolio with theatrical precision. "You've ignored 4 previous notices. You missed 2 scheduled hearings. You've even had your lawyer send us that ridiculous letter claiming some sort of historical protection." Her laugh was cold. "Historical protection for a hedge. Really, Ms. Chen?" The crew chief shifted uncomfortably. "Look, lady, We can come back another day if you need. Absolutely not. Margaret's voice cracked like a whip. We have a court order. Proceed. Sarah watched in numb horror as the crew unloaded their equipment. The chainsaw started with a brutal roar that seemed to tear through the morning peace. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared at her fence line, tears in her eyes. Old Mr. Peterson from across the street stood on his porch, shaking his head. The entire neighborhood was watching this execution. Please, Sarah tried one last time, turning to Margaret. This hedge, it meant everything to my grandmother. She was so proud of it. Neighbors used to stop just to admire how perfectly she'd shaped it. Margaret's expression didn't soften. If anything, her smile grew wider. Your grandmother should have thought about that before flouting our community standards. A hedge is just a hedge, Ms. Chen. Plants grow back. The first branch fell. Sarah closed her eyes as the chainsaw bit into 23 years of careful cultivation. Each cut felt like a physical blow. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. In Taiwan, we had walls to keep out the chaos. Here we plant our own walls, beautiful walls that birds can nest in, that give privacy without a fence. When she opened her eyes, Margaret was filming, with her phone. Really? Sarah's voice was barely controlled. You're documenting this? For our records, to show that the HOA takes covenant enforcement seriously. Margaret lowered her phone, her expression triumphant. This is what happens when people think they can ignore the rules that everyone else follows. The hedge was dying in chunks now, centuries of growth reduced to scattered branches. The crew worked with grim efficiency, their faces showing they took no pleasure in the destruction. One of them, a young man barely out of his teens, actually wiped his eyes. 47,000, Sarah said quietly. Excuse me? That's what it would cost to replace this hedge. I got quotes. Sarah's voice was steady now, ice cold. Mature English boxwood, professionally installed and shaped to this size. $47,000. Margaret shrugged. Then perhaps you'll choose your battles more carefully next time. By 11:30, it was over. 23 years of growth reduced to a pile of branches that would take 3 trips to haul away. Where her grandmother's magnificent hedge had stood, only a row of stumps remained, like broken teeth in a wounded smile. The crew chief approached Sarah with something that looked like guilt. Ma'am, we're sorry about this. Orders are orders, but I understand, Sarah said. You were just doing your job. Margaret was already back in her Lexus, windows up, air conditioning running. She rolled down her window just enough to speak. I trust this sends a clear message to the other residents. Rules exist for a reason. She paused, savoring her victory. Oh, and Ms. Chen? Don't forget about the special assessment we discussed. The architectural review process isn't free. The Lexus glided away, leaving Sarah standing in the ruins of her grandmother's masterpiece. Mrs. Rodriguez climbed over the low fence that separated their properties, her gardening gloves still dusty with soil. Mija, I'm so sorry. If there was anything we could have done, there wasn't, Sarah said, but her voice carried a strange note that made Mrs. Rodriguez look at her sharply. Sarah, you okay? Sarah was staring at something in the debris, a metal corner poking out from beneath a fallen branch. She knelt and carefully extracted a small bronze marker, green with age, its engraved letters still clear. Maplewood Estates. Boundary marker, 1924. Mrs. Rodriguez frowned. What's that? Sarah turned the marker over in her hands, her mind racing. Yesterday, while cleaning out her grandmother's papers, she'd found something interesting in an old shoebox, something Margaret Whitman and her precious HOA had no idea existed. Mrs. Rodriguez, Sarah said slowly, do you remember what my grandmother did before she retired? She was a secretary, wasn't she? At some downtown law firm? Not just any law firm. Henderson, Pike and Associates, real estate law. Sarah's smile was nothing like Margaret's sharp blade. It was warmer, deeper, and far more dangerous. She worked there for 35 years, and she never threw anything away. The pieces were falling into place now, the careful plan that had been forming since her grandmother's funeral, suddenly crystallizing into perfect clarity. Sarah looked at the boundary marker, then at the stumps of the hedge, then at the pristine lawns of Maplewood Estates stretching in all directions. "What are you thinking?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked, a note of concern in her voice. Sarah stood up, brushing dirt from her knees, the bronze marker warm in her palm. "I'm thinking Margaret Whitman just made the biggest mistake of her life." As if summoned by her thoughts, Margaret's Lexus reappeared at the end of the street, creeping slowly past Sarah's house. Margaret's window was down now, and she was talking on her phone, probably to another board member, probably already planning her next target. Sarah waved. Margaret's conversation faltered, and she stared at Sarah with obvious confusion. Why was the woman she'd just humiliated waving at her? Why did she look pleased? "Margaret!" Sarah called out sweetly. "Thank you so much for today." Margaret's car nearly drifted into the opposite lane. She ended her call and rolled down her window further. "What?" "I said thank you. You've been so incredibly helpful." Sarah's smile was radiant now, the kind of smile that made Peepa. Sarah's hands trembled as she spread the yellow documents across her grandmother's antique dining table. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced above papers that hadn't seen daylight in decades. At the center of it all lay the bronze boundary marker, its 1924 inscription catching the light like a promise. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," whispered Father McKenna, the elderly priest who had officiated at her grandmother's funeral and had become an unlikely ally in Sarah's quest for answers. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and leaned closer to examine the documents. "Sarah, do you understand what you're looking at?" Sarah's pulse hammered in her throat. "I think so, but I need you to confirm it." The priest had arrived an hour ago in response to Sarah's frantic phone call. She'd known him since childhood. He was the only person she trusted to help her navigate what she'd found in her grandmother's papers. More importantly, he was the only person in Maplewood who had been here longer than Margaret Whitman. "Start from the beginning," Father McKenna said, settling into the carved wooden chair that had been Lily Chen's favorite spot for morning tea. "Show me everything." Sarah picked up the first document, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "This is the original property deed for what's now called Maplewood Estates, dated March 15th, 1924. The priest nodded. "I remember the Maplewood family, old German immigrants. They owned this entire area, must have been 200 acres. 247 acres, Sarah corrected, pointing to a specific line in the deed. "But here's where it gets interesting. Look at this clause." Father McKenna squinted at the faded typescript. "All properties sold within the boundaries of the Maplewood estate shall maintain perpetual access to the original survey lines and boundary markers, and no homeowners association or similar governing body shall have authority to alter, remove, or supersede the original covenant restrictions without unanimous consent of all affected property owners." "Sweet Mother of God," the priest whispered. "There's more." Sarah's voice was gaining strength now, the lawyer she'd once dreamed of becoming finally emerging after years of doubt and defeat. "This next document is from 1961. A supplemental covenant filed by Heinrich Maplewood's grandson before he sold the land to developers." She spread out a second document, this one in better condition. "He was apparently concerned about what developers might do to his family's legacy, so he created what amounts to a legal time bomb." Father McKenna read aloud. "In perpetuity, the original boundary markers shall serve as the definitive property lines, regardless of subsequent surveys or development. Any attempt to alter landscaping, structures, or boundaries within 15 feet of said markers without proper historical survey and unanimous neighborhood consent shall be deemed void and unenforceable. My grandmother kept copies of everything, Sarah said, her voice thick with sudden emotion. Every transaction, every filing, every amendment. She knew this stuff existed, Father. She knew it when Margaret started targeting our family. The priest leaned back, his weathered face grave. Why didn't she use it? Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. Because she was 78 years old and tired of fighting. Because she thought Margaret would leave us alone after she was gone. Because... Sarah's voice broke slightly. Because she trusted that people would do the right thing. Father McKenna reached across the table and squeezed Sarah's hand. She raised you better than that. Did she? Sarah pulled up photos on her phone. The devastation from that morning, the pile of branches, the neat row of stumps. I let them destroy her hedge, Father. I stood there and watched them cut down 23 years of her work. You didn't let them do anything. They had a court order. Based on fraudulent authority. Sarah's voice was steel now. She picked up a surveyor's map from 1924, its edges brown with age. Look at this. The hedge wasn't just on our property, Father. It was marking the original boundary line. Margaret's precious covenant violations? They're meaningless. The HOA never had jurisdiction over that hedge in the first place. Father McKenna studied the map, tracing the property lines with his finger. This shows your lot extending 15 feet further south than the modern surveys indicate. Exactly. Which means the hedge was on my property. But more than that. Sarah pulled out another document, this one bearing an official seal. This is a legal brief my grandmother's firm, filed in 1987. Another homeowner tried to challenge these same restrictions. The court ruled that the original Maplewood covenants supersede any subsequent HOA agreements. Why wasn't this case more widely known? Because the homeowner dropped the suit, took a settlement, and moved away. Sarah's smile was sharp. But the legal precedent stands. Margaret's HOA has been operating under false authority for decades. Father McKenna was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents. When he looked up, his expression was troubled. Sarah, this is significant. If what you're saying is true, then half the enforcement actions the HOA has taken over the years were invalid. At least half. Sarah gathered the papers with careful precision. And that's just the beginning. I spent all morning going through Nai's files. Do you want to know what else I found? She pulled out a thick manila folder marked Neighborhood. Correspondence. Confidential. Letters, she said, opening the folder to reveal dozens of documents. Complaints filed against Margaret Whitman dating back to 2003, noise violations that were ignored, architectural modifications that were approved for her but denied for others, even a formal complaint about her using HOA funds for personal landscaping. Father McKenna's eyebrows rose. Where did these come from? Residents who gave up fighting. People who were bullied into compliance and then moved away. Sarah's voice hardened. My grandmother kept copies of everything they sent her, hoping someday someone would have the courage to use them. Margaret doesn't know about any of this? Margaret doesn't know about any of it. As far as she's concerned, she just won the biggest victory of her HOA presidency. She destroyed the last symbol of resistance to her authority. Sarah's smile was cold as winter morning. She has no idea she just handed me everything I need to destroy her. Father McKenna shifted uncomfortably. Sarah, I understand you're angry, but revenge? This isn't about revenge, Sarah interrupted. This is about justice. Do you know what Margaret's been doing to this neighborhood? Mrs. Rodriguez got fined $500 because her mailbox was the wrong shade of black. The Hendersons were forced to remove their children's swing set because it violated the aesthetic harmony of their backyard. Old Mr. Peterson has been fighting a 2-year battle over his garden gnomes. Garden. Gnomes! Apparently they're not architecturally appropriate. Sarah's voice dripped with sarcasm. But Margaret's hot tub? The one that's clearly visible from the street and violates at least 3 different covenant restrictions? That's perfectly fine. Father McKenna rubbed his temples. What are you planning to do? Sarah walked to the window, looking out at the stumps where her grandmother's hedge had stood. Margaret's house was visible across the small park that formed the center of their cul-de-sac. Even from here, Sarah could see the massive hot tub on Margaret's deck, the unauthorized pergola, the decorative fence that exceeded height restrictions by at least 18 inches. I'm going to give Margaret exactly what she's been giving everyone else, Sarah said quietly. Due process, legal consequences, enforcement of community standards. She turned back to the priest. I'm going to use her own weapons against her. How? Sarah picked up her phone and showed Father McKenna a contact screen. David Wu, attorney at law. He used to work with my grandmother at Henderson, Pike & Associates. He's been waiting 40 years for someone to challenge the HOA's authority. 40 years? He was the junior associate who worked on that 1987 case, the one where the homeowner took a settlement and moved away. Sarah's smile was predatory now. He's been sitting on this legal precedent ever since, waiting for the right client, with the right evidence and the right motivation. Father McKenna looked at the documents spread across the table, then at Sarah's determined face. This is going to get ugly. It's already ugly, Father. Margaret made sure of that when she destroyed my grandmother's hedge for her own amusement. Sarah began gathering the papers with methodical precision. The question is whether it gets ugly quietly, with Margaret agreeing to reasonable reforms, or whether it gets ugly publicly, with newspaper articles and court proceedings and very uncomfortable questions about how she's been running this HOA. And if she chooses to fight? Sarah held up the bronze boundary marker, its 1924 inscription gleaming in the afternoon light. Then she's going to learn exactly why my grandmother kept every single piece of paper that ever crossed her desk. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of Margaret's Lexus pulling into her driveway drifted through the open window. Sarah watched as the HOA president emerged from her car, arms loaded with shopping bags from expensive downtown boutiques. She looks happy, Father McKenna observed. She should enjoy it while it lasts. Sarah pulled out her phone and began, scrolling through her contacts. David Wu is expecting my call at 4 o'clock. By 5 o'clock, Margaret Whitman is going. Margaret Whitman was hosting her weekly bridge game when the doorbell rang at exactly 7:30 p.m. She glanced at the antique grandfather clock in her foyer with mild irritation. Her guests, 3 other HOA board members, were deep into their second. Rubber and interruptions were not welcome during Margaret's Tuesday evening ritual. I'll get it, she announced, setting down her cards with the precise movements that characterized everything she did. Through the beveled glass of her front door, she could see a figure in a dark suit holding what appeared to be an envelope. Margaret opened the door to find a young man in his 20s, professionally dressed with the serious demeanor of someone conducting official business. Mrs. Margaret Whitman? He asked, consulting a clipboard. Yes, that's correct. I'm here to serve you with legal documents. Are you the current president of the Maplewood Estates Homeowners Association? Margaret's stomach lurched, but her expression remained controlled. Yes, I am. What kind of documents? The young man handed her a thick manila envelope sealed with legal tape. Notice of legal challenge to HOA authority, demand for immediate cessation of enforcement actions and request for emergency judicial review. You've been served. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the envelope. What is this about? The plaintiff is Sarah Chen. Have a good evening, ma'am. Margaret watched the process server walk back to his car, her mind racing. Sarah Chen? The woman whose hedge they'd removed just that morning? What possible legal challenge could she mount? The HOA had followed proper procedures, had court authorization, had— "Margaret," called Eleanor Hutchins from the living room. "Is everything all right?" "Fine," Margaret called back, though her voice sounded strange even to her own ears. "Just a delivery. I'll be right there." She closed the door and leaned against it, staring at the envelope in her hands. Part of her wanted to tear it open immediately, but another part, the part that had survived 15 years of neighborhood politics, warned her to be prepared for whatever was inside. Margaret walked to her home office, a pristine space dominated by filing cabinets containing every HOA document from the past decade. She sat at her mahogany desk and carefully opened the envelope, her bridge game forgotten. The first document made her blood run cold. Notice of legal challenge to Homeowners Association Authority case, number 2024 CV 8847, Sarah L. Chen v. Maplewood Estates Homeowners Association, et al. Her eyes scanned the legal language, each paragraph hitting like a physical blow. The plaintiff claimed that the HOA lacked authority to enforce certain covenants due to superseding historical property restrictions dating to the original 1924 Maplewood estate development. "That's impossible," Margaret whispered. She'd researched the neighborhood's history when she'd first joined the board. There were no restrictions that superseded their HOA covenants. There couldn't be. She flipped to the next page and felt the air leave her lungs. Exhibit A, Original Maplewood Estate Covenant Restrictions, 1924. The document was clearly authentic. Aged paper, official seals, the distinctive typography of 1920s legal documents. Margaret read the key passage 3 times before its implications fully sank in. All properties sold within the boundaries of the Maplewood estate shall maintain perpetual access to the original survey lines and boundary markers, and no homeowners. Association or similar governing body shall have authority to alter, remove, or supersede the original covenant restrictions without unanimous consent of all affected property owners. "Margaret?" Eleanor's voice was closer now. "The girls are getting worried. You've been gone 20 minutes. I'll be right there," Margaret managed, though she made no move to leave her chair. She turned to Exhibit B, a surveyor's map. From 1924, showing property boundaries that differed significantly from modern surveys. The Chen property, according to this map, extended 15 feet further south than current records indicated, which meant the Hedge was on her property, Margaret whispered. "It was never a violation." Exhibit C was worse, a legal precedent from 1987, Henderson versus Oakwood Hills HOA, which ruled that original estate covenants superseded subsequent homeowners association agreements. The case had been settled out of court, but not before a judge had issued a preliminary ruling that made Margaret's blood pressure spike. But it was Exhibit D that made Margaret's hands shake so violently she nearly dropped the papers. Documented violations of selective enforcement policies, evidence of discriminatory application of HOA covenants. What followed was a comprehensive list of Margaret's own covenant violations dating back 15 years. Her unauthorized hot tub installation, the pergola that exceeded height restrictions, the decorative fence that violated the open concept requirement. Even her mailbox, which was apparently the wrong shade of black according to the very standards she'd used to fine Mrs. Rodriguez. Each violation was documented with photographs, dates, and corresponding enforcement actions taken against other residents for identical infractions. "Dear God," Margaret breathed. The final document was a cover letter from David Wu, attorney at law. Margaret recognized the firm name. Henderson, Pike, and Associates had been involved in several high-profile real estate cases over the years. The letter was brief and devastating. "Mrs. Whitman, my client, Ms. Sarah Chen, is prepared to resolve this matter quietly and amicably. She requests the following. 1. Immediate cessation of all enforcement actions based on disputed HOA authority. 2. Public acknowledgement that the hedge removal was conducted in error. 3. Full restitution for damages, $47,000 plus legal fees. 4. Reform of HOA procedures to comply with original estate covenants. 5. Your resignation as HOA president within 30 days. Alternatively, Ms. Chen is prepared to pursue full legal remedies, including criminal charges for destruction of property, civil penalties for selective enforcement, and public disclosure of all documented violations by current board members. You have 48 hours to respond. Respectfully, David Wu. Esquire. Margaret's office door opened, and Eleanor Hutchins peered in with concern. "Margaret, what on earth?" She stopped, taking in Margaret's pale face and trembling hands. "What's wrong?" "I think—" Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. "I think I may have made a serious mistake." Eleanor entered the office and closed the door behind her. As the HOA's vice president, she was Margaret's closest ally and confidant. "What kind of mistake?" Margaret handed her the legal documents without a word. Eleanor was a retired legal secretary. She would understand the implications better than the other board members. Eleanor's expression grew increasingly grave as she read. When she finished, she set the papers down carefully and looked at Margaret, with something that might have been pity. "Jesus, Margaret. How did you not know about this?" "Know about what?" "There's no record of these covenants in our files. I've been president for 8 years. I would have seen—" "Did you ever research the original property development? The historical records?" Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. We always worked from the existing HOA documentation. Everything was in order when I took over from Bob Richardson." "Bob Richardson was president for 6 months," Eleanor said sharply. "He inherited the position when Jim Hartley moved to Florida. Neither of them were here for the original development. Margaret, you've been enforcing covenants that may have been invalid from the beginning." The implications were staggering. 15 years of fines, forced modifications, legal threats, all potentially based on fraudulent authority. "What do I do?" Margaret asked, and for the first time in years, she sounded genuinely uncertain. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents again. "You have 2 choices," she said finally. "Accept Chen's terms and hope this stays quiet, or fight it in court and risk everything becoming public record." "Fight what? This is clearly legitimate." "Look at these documents. They're authentic. The legal precedent is solid, and the evidence of selective enforcement." Margaret gestured helplessly at the papers. "She has us dead to rights." "Then you know what you have to do." Margaret looked out her office window toward the Chen house. The stumps of the destroyed hedge were barely visible in the gathering darkness, but she could imagine Sarah Chen sitting in her grandmother's house, probably celebrating her victory. She planned this, Margaret realized. She knew about these covenants when we served the violation notice. She let us destroy the hedge knowing she could use it against us. Can you blame her? Margaret thought about that morning, her satisfaction at watching the hedge fall, her enjoyment at filming the destruction, her smug confidence as she'd driven away. Sarah Chen had stood there and let it happen, knowing all along that Margaret was building her own trap. $47,000, Margaret whispered, plus legal fees, plus the cost of admitting I've been wrong about everything for 8 years. Eleanor gathered the documents and handed them back to Margaret. The cost of fighting this in court will be 10 times higher, and that's assuming you can find a lawyer willing to take the case. Most attorneys won't touch HOA disputes when the evidence is this clear. From the living room came the sound of chair legs scraping against hardwood floors. The bridge game was breaking up, the other board members preparing to leave. "Margaret," called Janet Morrison, the HOA secretary, "we should probably discuss the Chen situation while we're all H." Richard Bartow arrived at Margaret's house 43 minutes later, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled from the emergency call. As the HOA's primary legal counsel for the past 12 years, he'd handled everything from minor covenant disputes to major construction litigation. But the urgency in Margaret's voice had sent him racing across town with a growing sense of dread. Margaret met him at the door, her face drawn and pale. "Richard, thank God. I need you to tell me this isn't as bad as I think it is." "Show me what we're dealing with." They settled in Margaret's office, the legal documents spread across the desk like evidence at a crime scene. Richard's expression grew increasingly grim as he examined each exhibit, occasionally muttering under his breath or reaching for his reading glasses to examine fine print. "Jesus Christ, Margaret," he finally said, leaning back in his chair. "Where did she get these documents?" "I have no idea. The original covenants, the survey maps, the legal precedent, I've never seen any of this before." Richard held up the 1924 property deed, studying the official seals and signatures. "This is authentic. The paper, the ink, the typography, this is genuine 1920s documentation." He set it down carefully. "Margaret, do you understand what this means? That we made a mistake with the hedge? That you've been operating without legal authority for years?" Richard's voice was sharp with professional alarm. "This isn't about one hedge. If these original covenants supersede your HOA agreement, and based on this legal precedent they clearly do, then every enforcement action you've taken may be invalid." Margaret felt the room spinning slightly. "Every enforcement action? Every fine, every architectural denial, every forced modification?" Richard picked up the selective enforcement documentation. "And this evidence of discriminatory application makes it 10 times worse. Margaret, you personally violated the same covenants you've been enforcing against others. A first-year law student could win this case. So what do we do?" Richard was quiet for a long moment, studying the cover letter from David Wu. "I know Wu. He's one of the best real estate attorneys in the state. If he's representing Chen, she's not bluffing about taking this to court. Can we fight it?" "Fight what?" "The evidence is overwhelming, the legal precedent is solid, and your client has documented violations going back 15 years. Richard shook his head. "Margaret, I've been practicing law for 30 years. This is the most clear-cut case of HOA overreach I've ever seen." Margaret's hands clenched into fists. "So Chen wins? She gets everything she's asking for?" "Chen isn't asking for everything she could get. Look at these demands again." Richard held up the cover letter. "47,000 in restitution, procedural reforms, and your resignation. Margaret, if she wanted to destroy you, she could be asking for punitive damages in the hundreds of thousands. She could demand criminal prosecution for property destruction. She could file a class action suit on behalf of every resident you've fined over the years." The implications of that possibility made Margaret's stomach lurch. A class action suit? Think about it. Mrs. Rodriguez's mailbox fine, the Hendersons' swing set removal, Mr. Peterson's garden gnome battle. If all those enforcement actions were based on invalid authority, the HOA could be liable for massive damages. Richard leaned forward. "Margaret, Chen is offering you a way out. I'd strongly advise you to take it." "But my resignation? I've been president for 8 years. This community is my life's work." Richard's expression softened slightly. "Your life's work was built on a legal foundation that doesn't exist. I'm sorry, Margaret, but you have to face reality. Either you resign quietly or you risk losing everything in court." Margaret stood and walked to her window, looking out at the neighborhood she'd ruled for nearly a decade. Every perfectly manicured lawn, every regulation mailbox, every covenant-compliant driveway represented her vision of community standards. The idea of walking away from it all felt like death. "How long do I have to decide?" "Wu's letter gives you 48 hours. But Margaret..." Richard's voice carried a warning. "Don't wait. The longer you delay, the more likely Chen is to escalate this." As if summoned by their conversation, Margaret's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. Mrs. Whitman, this is Janet Morrison. I just got home from bridge and found a very interesting envelope on my doorstep. Margaret's blood turned to ice. Janet was the HOA secretary, one of her closest allies on the board. What kind of envelope? Legal documents. It seems Ms. Chen has some very serious allegations about our HOA's authority and about certain irregularities in enforcement procedures. Richard was watching Margaret's face, reading the catastrophe unfolding in real time. "I'll call you back, Janet," Margaret managed. "No need. I'm calling an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. sharp. I think we all need to see these documents together." The line went dead. Margaret turned to Richard with growing panic. She served papers on the entire board. Smart. Wu's covering all the bases, making sure every board member understands the legal exposure. Richard gathered his papers. "Margaret, you need to call Chen tonight. Don't wait for the board meeting. Don't let this become a public spectacle." "Call her and say what? That I surrender?" "Call her and negotiate. Find out what she really wants. Maybe there's a way to resolve this that doesn't end with your resignation." Margaret looked at Richard hopefully. "You think she might be willing to compromise?" "I think she's been planning this for months, and she holds all the cards. But people can be reasonable when they get what they need." Richard paused. "What do you know about her personally? What drives her?" Margaret thought about Sarah Chen, the quiet woman who'd inherited her grandmother's house 6 months ago, who'd seemed so defeated during the early violation hearings, who'd stood helplessly while the hedge was destroyed. She loved her grandmother. The hedge was some kind of family legacy. Margaret's voice was barely audible. "I destroyed something irreplaceable to her. Then maybe this isn't about money or power. Maybe it's about respect." Richard stood to leave. "Margaret, I've seen a lot of neighborhood disputes over the years. The ones that end badly are usually the ones where people forget they're dealing with human beings, not just property values." After Richard left, Margaret sat alone in her office, staring at Sarah Chen's phone number on the legal documents. It was nearly 11 p.m., too late for a social call, but appropriate for an emergency. She dialed before she could lose her nerve. Sarah answered on the second ring, her voice alert despite the late hour. "Ms. Chen speaking." "Sarah, this is Margaret Whitman. I received your legal documents this evening. I was wondering when you'd call." Sarah's voice was calm, professional. "Have you had a chance to review them thoroughly?" "I've reviewed them with my attorney. The evidence is comprehensive." "My grandmother was very thorough in her record-keeping." Margaret closed her eyes. "Sarah, I want you to know that I had no idea about the original covenants. If I had known, you would have what? Treated my family with respect? Followed proper legal procedures? Applied the rules fairly to everyone?" Sarah's voice remained controlled, but there was steel beneath the surface. "Mrs. Whitman, you destroyed my grandmother's hedge for sport. You filmed it happening. You threatened me with additional fines just for the pleasure of watching me suffer." The words hit Margaret like physical blows because they were undeniably true. "I was wrong. I can see that now." "Can you? Because this morning you told me that a hedge is just a hedge, that plants grow back. Do you still believe that?" Margaret thought about her own garden, the rose bushes she'd cultivated for 15 years, the satisfaction she felt every morning looking at her perfectly maintained landscape. "No, I don't believe that anymore." "Good. That's progress." Sarah's voice softened slightly. "Mrs. Whitman, I'm not interested in destroying you personally, but I won't let what happened to my family happen to anyone else in this neighborhood." "What do you want from me, Sarah?" "I want you to read my demands again, carefully, and I want you to understand that they're not negotiable." Margaret looked at the cover letter, at the list of 5 demands that would end her presidency and require her to admit 8 years of mistakes. The resignation requirement is non-negotiable. You've lost the moral authority to lead this community. More importantly, you've lost the legal authority. But if I resign, who will? The community will elect new leadership. Leadership that understands the law and respects the rights of all residents. Sarah paused. Mrs. Whitman, you have 47 hours remaining to accept my terms. After that, Mr. Wu will file a motion for emergency judicial review, and this entire matter becomes public record. Margaret's mind raced through the implications of a public court case, newspaper coverage, neighborhood gossip, the humiliation of having her authority challenged in open court. If I agree to your terms, this stays private? If you agree to my terms, resign with dignity, and commit to genuine reform of HOA procedures, then yes, this stays between us and the board members. And if I don't? Sarah's voice turned cold. Then you'll discover exactly how much legal trouble one person can cause when they have time, money, and documented evidence of systematic abuse of power. The threat was delivered so calmly that it took Margaret a moment to... The Maplewood Estates Community Center had never felt smaller. Margaret arrived at 7:45 a.m. to find the parking lot already half full. Word had spread through the neighborhood overnight with the efficiency of a wildfire. She could see residents clustered in small groups, their voices low but urgent, their expressions ranging from confusion to outright hostility. Mrs. Rodriguez stood near the entrance with the Hendersons and Mr. Peterson, all three holding manila envelopes identical to the ones that had been delivered to the board members. Margaret's stomach sank as she realized Sarah hadn't limited her legal revelations to the HOA leadership. "Margaret," called Eleanor Hutchins from across the parking lot. "We need to talk before this starts." Margaret approached her longtime ally with dread. Eleanor's face was grim, her usual composure replaced by barely controlled anger. "Did you know?" Eleanor demanded without preamble. "Did you know about any of this when you pushed for the hedge removal?" "Eleanor, I swear to you, I had no idea. Because if you knew and didn't tell us, you've exposed every board member to personal liability. Do you understand that?" Margaret looked around the parking lot at her fellow board members. Janet Morrison standing alone by her car, phone pressed to her ear, probably talking to her own attorney. Tom Bradley pacing near the building entrance, his face flushed with stress. David Kumar reading through his copy of the legal documents with the focused intensity of a man calculating his exposure. "No one knew," Margaret said quietly. "The original covenants weren't in our files. There was no institutional memory. There should have been research, due diligence. Margaret, you've been enforcing rules for 8 years without ever verifying our legal authority." Eleanor's voice was tight with controlled fury. "Do you have any idea what this could cost us personally?" Before Margaret could respond, Sarah Chen emerged from a dark sedan, accompanied by an older Asian man in an expensive suit. David Wu, Margaret realized. Even from across the parking lot, the attorney's presence changed the atmosphere. Residents straightened, board members tensed, and Margaret felt her remaining confidence evaporate. Sarah was dressed professionally in a navy suit, her black hair pulled back in a neat bun. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who held all the cards and knew exactly how to play them. As she walked toward the community center, residents approached her, Mrs. Rodriguez with tears in her eyes, Mr. Peterson with obvious gratitude, the Hendersons with expressions of vindicated relief. "She's got half the neighborhood on her side already," Eleanor observed. "Can you blame them?" Margaret asked, then immediately regretted the words. Eleanor stared at her. "Are you seriously taking her side now?" "I'm taking reality's side. Eleanor, look at the evidence. Look at what we've done to these people." Margaret gestured toward Mr. Peterson, who was showing Sarah photographs on his phone. Probably pictures of the garden gnomes he'd been forced to remove. "We've been bullies, legal bullies with invalid authority. So what do you want to do? Roll over and surrender?" Margaret looked at the community center. at the residents filing in for what would likely be the most contentious meeting in Maplewood estate's history. "I want to do what's right, for once." Eleanor's expression softened slightly. "Margaret, I've known you for 15 years. You're not a bad person, you got drunk on the power. We all did. A little bit." "Some more than others," Margaret said quietly. They entered the community center together, the familiar space transformed by tension and uncertainty. The usual seating arrangement, bored. Members at the front table, residents in neat rows, had been abandoned. Instead, people clustered in informal groups, the atmosphere more like a town hall revolution than a routine HOA meeting. Sarah and David Wu sat in the front row, their legal documents neatly organized on the table before them. Wu was reviewing notes while Sarah watched the room with calm attention, occasionally nodding to residents who approached to speak with her. Margaret took her place at the board table, acutely aware that it might be the last time she occupied the president's chair. The other board members settled in with obvious reluctance. Janet Morrison looked like she wanted to be anywhere else. Tom Bradley kept checking his phone for messages from his attorney, and David Kumar maintained the carefully neutral expression of a man trying to avoid legal liability. "Before we begin," Margaret announced, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room, "I want to acknowledge that we're facing an unprecedented situation. Last night, several residents received legal documents challenging the authority of this HOA. These documents raise serious questions about our enforcement procedures and our compliance with historical property restrictions." A murmur ran through the room. Mrs. Rodriguez raised her hand. "Margaret, does this mean the $500 fine for my mailbox was illegal?" Margaret looked at Sarah, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "It appears that many of our recent enforcement actions may have exceeded our legal authority. We're reviewing all cases with our attorney." "What about my swing set?" called out Mrs. Henderson. "You made us tear down our children's swing set for violating architectural standards that you apparently had no right to enforce?" The murmur became a rumble of angry voices. Margaret held up her hand for quiet, but the gesture that had once commanded instant respect now seemed pathetic and ineffective. David Wu stood smoothly, his movement commanding attention in a way Margaret's had not. "If I may address the community?" Margaret nodded, feeling like she was ceding her authority with the gesture. "My name is David Wu, and I represent Ms. Sarah Chen. Many of you received copies of our legal filing last night. I want to clarify what these documents mean for your community." Wu's voice was professional but warm, the tone of a teacher explaining complex concepts to interested students. "The original Maplewood estate covenants filed in 1924 contain restrictions that supersede your current HOA agreement. This means that for many years, your HOA has been enforcing rules it had no legal authority to enforce." Mr. Peterson stood up, his voice shaking with emotion. "Does this mean I can put my garden gnomes back?" A few people laughed, breaking some of the tension. Wu smiled. "Mr. Peterson, according to the original covenants, decorative garden elements are specifically protected as expressions of individual property rights. Your gnomes were never in violation of valid restrictions." The laughter stopped, replaced by something harder, the sound of people realizing they'd been wronged. Margaret watched the mood in the room shift from confusion to understanding to anger. "What about our property values?" asked Tom Bradley, speaking for the first time. "If people can do whatever they want—" "The original covenants aren't permissive," Wu interrupted. "They establish clear standards for property maintenance and architectural harmony. The difference is that they're legally valid, fairly applied, and designed to protect individual rights rather than concentrate power in the hands of a few board members." Margaret felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her. She stood slowly, her legs unsteady. I think we need to address the elephant in the room. Mr. Wu, your client is demanding my resignation as part of any settlement. I want the community to understand why." Sarah stood as well, her movement graceful and controlled. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the room. Mrs. Whitman destroyed my grandmother's hedge yesterday morning. She filmed it happening. She took pleasure in it. Sarah's voice remained calm, but the emotion beneath was unmistakable. That hedge took 23 years to grow. It was my grandmother's pride and joy, her legacy, her gift to this community. Mrs. Rodriguez wiped her eyes. It was beautiful. We all loved watching Lily work on it. Mrs. Whitman destroyed it based on invalid legal authority, Sarah continued. But more than that, she destroyed it as an act of petty tyranny. She wanted to send a message that resistance to her power would not be tolerated. Margaret felt her face burning. Sarah, You told me that a hedge is just a hedge, that plants grow back. You were wrong on both counts. Sarah's eyes met Margaret's across the room. A hedge isn't just a hedge when it represents 23 years of love and care. And some things, once destroyed, can never grow back. The room was silent now, the weight of Sarah's words settling over everyone present. Janet Morrison cleared her throat. What exactly are you proposing, Ms. Chen? Sarah sat down, yielding the floor to David Wu. Ms. Chen's terms are simple and reasonable. Full restitution for the destroyed hedge, reform of HOA procedures to comply with original covenants, and new leadership that understands the difference between community standards and personal power. You want Margaret to resign? Eleanor said flatly. We want Margaret to take responsibility for 8 years of illegal enforcement actions, Wu replied. Resignation is the first step toward rebuilding. Trust in this community. Margaret looked around the room at faces she'd known for years. Some angry, some sympathetic, all watching to see what she would do. She thought about the phone call last night, about Sarah's calm recitation of consequences, about her grandmother's belief that people could change. I have something to say, Margaret announced, her voice stronger than she felt. The room quieted. 8 years ago, I became president of this HOA because I believed in community standards. I believed that rules and our